I'm talking today to David Rogers, who's Professor of Ecology in the Department of Zoology at Oxford University. Now, David, both as a citizen of this earth and as an ecologist, you've been taking a special interest in climate change, which in practice means global warming and all that goes with it, have you not? We obviously don't have time to address all the issues, but I just want to discuss first what the British government has intended to do in general to contain global warming and how to adapt to it. And in particular, I want to home in on the potential of solar power to replace fossil fuels, with special reference to onshore solar farms, which the government seems to be very keen on. Are they really what Britain needs? So first of all, what are the government's plans for tackling climate change?
Well, Colin, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. I think the government was the first of the G7 nations to sign up to a zero carbon economy by 2050. And now something like 95% of the world's economies have signed up to a similar zero carbon objective. One of the ways which we might reach that objective is to decarbonise all of our energy supplies. There are all sorts of other things we have to do as well. For example, insulate our homes so we use less energy overall. So one of these, the package, if you like, of renewable energies is a way to decarbonise our very carbon intensive energy sources. Traditionally it was coal, we've stopped burning coal, and then it was oil fired or gas fired power stations. We still rely very heavily on gas fired power stations for our basic energy supplies, electricity supplies. But more and more renewables are now coming on stream with government targets by 2030 of 35 gigawatts of solar power, 50 gigawatts of onshore wind and 55 gigawatts of offshore wind.
Right, good. How realistic in general terms are these targets?
I think they're achievable. And for example, if you take the 35 gigawatts of solar power by 2030, sorry, it's 50 gigawatts. We've got about 34 gigawatts within the planning system. Only about 10 of those gigawatts are actually operational, but there are a lot more coming down the pipeline and they would be ready by 2030. So it's not that we can't achieve those objectives, it's the way in which we do it and where we put the renewables, which I think is the matter for debate. You can't simply put any renewable anywhere. That doesn't make any sense. We have to integrate the renewable systems with everything else we might want to do, for example, with the landscape in which we live.
And if we did achieve these targets, however much by 2030 or even by 2050, what proportion of the total energy would that amount to of the world's energy?
Of the world's energy, I can't say. I think we have to look at the national grid's future energy scenarios. At the moment, the country is using something like 1,700 terawatt hours of energy a year. They want to get that down to 1,200 terawatts of energy a year by 2050. That's a 20% reduction in our present energy usages. And the interesting thing is, I mean, this assumes we will insulate our homes. The new homes we built will be built to a much better standard, that we will decarbonise our transport system. So the biggest fall in that 20% reduction is expected to be in transport, which should reduce carbon emissions by more than half, and in domestic use, just under half reduction. That will achieve an overall reduction in our total demand for electricity. And as I say, in the UK, the aim is that all of that demand should be met by renewables. Now, I think we'll see later on that's probably not possible, but it's a useful aim to have. The problem is, of course, renewables are, by their very nature, intermittent, and that's a real problem.
We'll come on to that. Yes, good. I want to focus on solar power. What is the potential for solar power worldwide?
There's a huge potential. If you think about it, the whole of planet Earth is powered by photosynthesis. The food we eat is powered by the plants, which are solar powered. And the efficiency of conversion of solar energy to plant biomass is about 1%. It's very small. There's a very good reason for that. If plants try to capture more solar energy, they simply boil. They would just overheat. The solar panels we've invented are already much more efficient than plants. They have about a 20% or more efficiency. So there's a huge untapped potential of solar energy for the planet. If we captured all the sunlight, we could power the planet many, many times over.
Really?
Yeah, there's no question of that.
But realistically, how much of it would we need to capture to,
Well, we'd need to capture whatever our predicted future energy demands are, so 1,200 terawatts in a place like England. Well, we've done some calculations which suggest that if you wanted to provide all the predicted electricity demand of England in 2050, you'd have to cover about 10% of the landscape with solar panels, about 20% of the landscape with onshore wind, and the equivalent of about 30% of the landscape with offshore wind. The thing about wind farms is if you draw a red line around a wind farm boundary, it's a very large area because the turbines have to be spaced quite a long way apart because they interfere with each other. But in fact, the wind industry tells us that, of course, the masts that are holding up the turbines, they only occupy 1% of the space. So if you're planning an onshore wind farm, it might take up a lot of area, but in fact you could do lots of things underneath the turbines, as they termed. You could do normal agriculture, for example, on the 99% of the land that wasn't masts supporting those turbines.
okay, this is what could be done, but how is it likely to be done? I mean, what's the real thing?
I think the short-term aims are possible. I mean, there are always bumps in the road. For example, the government has a scheme called the Contracts for Difference scheme, which is to encourage renewable energy of all sorts: offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, tidal, nuclear, and so on. And there have been several rounds of bids for the Contracts for Difference, which give a guaranteed price for every megawatt hour of energy produced by the different systems. And in the last round, round 5, for example, the government wasn't offering enough, or the industry considered wasn't offering enough to interest offshore wind investors. So there were no bids at all for the offshore wind. The contract price then was of the order of about £50 per megawatt hour of electricity. And the offshore industry said that that's not enough. In the present 6th round, they've upped the price to £70 per megawatt hour, and they've got lots of takers. So at that price, the offshore wind industry is interested in investing in offshore wind turbines to generate electricity to contribute to our net zero targets.
And how would that £70 per megawatt compare with the cost of energy now?
Okay, so this is, I mean, you have to dig into the details here. That if you regard, let's say, gas as the major alternative, polluting, of course, carbon dioxide producing, before the energy crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the European price for gas powered electricity, if you like, it's the farm gate price for electricity, the price that the producers are paid, not the price the consumers pay, was of the order about €50 per megawatt hour. Now, with Russian invasion, that shot up to £200 or £300 per megawatt hour. It's now come back down again, but it's approaching €100 per megawatt hour. It's about 80 or €90 per megawatt hour. So very crudely, you compare the farm gate gas price of 80 to 90 euros, £70, to the contract for different price in the current round of £60 for solar, £70 for offshore wind. They're very, very comparable prices. Things will change. The government predicts that gas prices will once again go up to make renewables competitive. But at the moment, the farm gate prices, the renewables aren't competitive. They're just the thing we should be doing to stop climate change or to contribute to reduction in our carbon outputs.
When it comes to solar power, of course, Britain is not the best place, is it?
You said it. If they were the equivalent of a Eurovision Song Contest for solar output, Britain would get 0 points from the global community. There was a wonderful report by the World Bank recently, about 2 years ago, looking at the solar photovoltaic potential of the world's countries. And Namibia, for example, has the best potential. It's a nice sunny area, it gets lots of sunshine. It has the potential for about 6 or 7 hours a day of full sunshine, producing full output from any solar farm. And then you look down the list, and you look down the list of 240 countries. You say, where is the UK in this list? As you go down the list, you see Australia, you see bits of Europe, and you have to get down to 239th position to find the UK. And the only country which is worst in their solar photovoltaic potential than the UK is Ireland, which has more clouds than we do. Probably the same amount of sunshine, but more clouds, so less. And in England, the solar farms are producing their maximum output for about 2.6 hours a day. This is the problem of intermittency. Solar power is good, but if you could only get it for 2.6 hours a day, who or what provides electricity for the other 21.4 hours a day that we need electricity?
This raises several questions. First of all, given that Africa is so good, particularly places like Namibia, could Africa in fact power the whole world?
Africa could indeed power the whole world. I mean, you have to imagine all the infrastructure that would be required. But again, a different World Bank report reckons that Africa is the best continent by far for its solar photovoltaic potential. It could provide something like 61% of the world's total energy demands. That's not happening for all sorts of historical and infrastructure reasons. But I would just point out that Northern Africa, and Morocco in particular, is heavily investing in renewables. And in about central Morocco, they have established the X-Links project, which is funded by the UK, and it's to deliver 3.6 gigawatts of guaranteed power to the UK in the next 5 or 10 years, straight from Morocco, straight into 7 million UK homes. It would provide something like 8% of our total energy demands. Now, the secret about Morocco is, of course, not only has more sunshine than we do, but it will have wind turbines as well. Because another feature of Morocco is that the onshore winds are much more stable than around the UK. We have very blustery winds. It's blowing one day and it's not the next. But the Sahara winds are much more constant, so you get a more constant wind power. If you combine wind power with solar power, with, in Morocco's case, battery storage as well, they can guarantee those 3.6 gigawatts of power to the UK for 20 hours a day to power 7 million homes. This shows you, I think, the example shows that in the tropics, where there's lots of sunshine and if it's planned properly, you can indeed power a lot of homes from solar. But as you go farther north into the temperate regions where the sun doesn't shine so much, it's much less of an attractive or, in my view, feasible proposition.
But the trouble, of course, with producing energy in Africa for us, well, how do you get the energy from one place to another?
Well, again, it's part of the project. It's a 9 billion project. It was signed off by Claire Coutinho, the previous Department for Net Zero Secretary of State, and it involves laying 2 cables, high voltage DC cables from Morocco straight into North Devon. It's a straight supply from Morocco, specifically to the UK.
And when we get it to the UK, what you get?
Well, effectively like any offshore wind facility, you have landfall in North Devon in this case. You have a substation, a huge one, I guess, and then that feeds into the national grid, the 400 kilovolt overhead system that distributes our electricity at present.
How do you overcome the intermittency problem, whether you're in Britain or whether you're in Africa?
Well, the intermittency problem is, of course, more serious in Britain for the simple reason that a solar farm only produces energy for 2.6 hours a day, whereas the Moroccan scheme will produce it for 19 hours a day. So you've got a shortfall of 5 hours in Morocco, you've got a shortfall of more than 22 hours in England. It's one of the reasons why I think it's not very attractive. And the intermittency problem is tied up with a very simple concept called the load factor, which people get very confused by. Now, if you buy a wind farm, or if you buy, let's say if you buy a solar panel, there will be a number stamped on the side of the solar panel. It'll say 400 watts, let's say. Now, you might imagine you stick it out, you get 400 watts of power all the time. You won't. 400 watts is the maximum output from that solar panel under ideal conditions. And the ideal conditions are within a laboratory, you shine 1,000 watts of power, which is the maximum solar radiance at the world's surface, onto that panel, and it produces 400 watts. In the normal course of events, you put it out into the field, it doesn't produce 400 watts of power all the time. The question is, how much of the time can you expect it to produce 400 watts? And this is the load factor. So the load factor for solar panels in England is about 10 or 11%. That means it's generating effectively its maximum power, 400 watts, for 10 or 11% of the time, which is 2.6 hours a day. Now, it's not that it's producing 400 watts for 2.6 hours and then it's stopping. It's that it's producing the equivalent of that. So it might be producing half that power for twice as long, or a third of that power for 3 times as long. But what the electricity supply companies are interested in is the total power in the daytime. And it's the same in all those 3 cases. Full power for 2.6 hours, half power for 5.2 hours, and so on. They want megawatt hours to deliver to the customer. So the load factor tells you effectively what the performance of a system is. And the same thing applies not just to individual solar panels, but to whole solar farms. They also have a 10% load factor.
And of course, when you the time that you actually get the energy,
yes,
in a country like Britain, it's not necessarily the time that people actually need it.
So if you think of solar energy in the UK, you're getting maximum energy between about 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. If you look at the domestic demand for electricity, it's actually quite low at midday because people are at work and so on. So there's quite a peak of demand when we get up, 8 o'clock in the morning. Solar's no good for that. And then it's a ramping peak up from when we come home from about 5 o'clock in the evening to 9 o'clock in the evening when we switch the television off or on. Our energy demand is not synchronized with the energy supply from solar electricity. This is a huge problem. So if you think of a solar farm without any battery backup at all, in other words, it can only provide when it's providing electricity to a certain number of houses. It will only provide the electricity those houses need at the time they need it for about 44% of the time. So it's either producing more energy than houses need at some times of day, midday for example, and it's not providing any energy at all at other times of day when they really need it. They're cooking supper, for example.
So how do you get around this? Besides batteries, you've mentioned batteries, but how useful are they and what's the alternative to them?
The intermittency problem is solved with batteries, or at least people hope it will be solved with batteries. So when you've got an excess of solar energy, if you have, you put it into batteries and then you can simply drain the batteries when you don't have solar power. There are various forms of battery storage. The common one is, of course, the lithium-ion batteries we imagine in our cars and our electric drills and so on. These are very, very efficient, but they can't provide energy for very long. So, for example, all of the solar farms that are putting battery storage in, they're putting enough storage to provide an extra 2 hours of energy production from that solar farm, extra 2 hours per day. Now that might work on a daily basis. It doesn't cover when you use electricity at midnight, for example, but it certainly doesn't cover the seasonal problem, because that figure I gave you before of a standard farm producing electricity when we want it for 44% of the time, that's the average throughout the year. In summer, it can produce 60% of the energy when we want it. But in winter, it only produces 24% of the energy. I mean, solar power in winter is almost a dead loss. So that raises the issue of seasonal storage of power, not within a day storage that batteries will do, but seasonal storage. This is technically an incredibly difficult problem. Now, the answer to that is different sorts of batteries. Lithium-ion batteries are great because they have a low weight for the energy they produce. There are alternative batteries called flow batteries. There's an iron flow battery and there's a vanadium flow batteries. These are much bigger and heavier than lithium-ion batteries, but they can store as much or more electricity for very much longer periods of time. So flow batteries for longer periods of storage, but I think the ultimate solution, the seasonal solution, the winter solution, is to turn electricity into something like hydrogen. And hydrogen is a wonderful energy source. You can burn it just like we burn gas to produce electricity in winter. And hydrogen also has the potential to power other parts of our energy system, perhaps domestic gas consumption, perhaps some forms of transport, for example, heavy transport, and maybe turn it into biofuels for aviation.
Is Britain focused enough on hydrogen power?
It's said that Britain doesn't need government investment in hydrogen power because private industry recognises the potential of hydrogen power. It's prepared to invest. It is investing. It doesn't need a government nudge to do it. Now, I'm not quite sure how far along we are on that road because it's not just producing the hydrogen, it's distributing it, it's storing it, massive quantities of hydrogen. And it may, for example, be more efficient to store it in the form of ammonia, which is very hydrogen intensive, but it occupies less volume. You don't have to compress it and so on as much. And you could simply release the hydrogen by turning ammonia back into hydrogen. So there's a huge potential for hydrogen. I think hydrogen storage raises the general issue of storage in general, seasonal storage in general. I think this is where the UK is way behind in its planning. In all of the predictions for tripling, quadrupling renewable sources, I don't see the equivalent of, well, if you've got all that renewable energy at certain times of the year or when the wind's blowing, how do we store the excess for times when the sun isn't shining, the wind's not blowing? We've not done enough of that. It's recognised by Royal Society reports and so on. We need to get on with this, but we're not.
Because with hydrogen you can power vehicles, for example,
Yes,
directly.
yes.
Hugo Spowers, River Simple, down in Wales, who's already produced a lovely little hydrogen-powered car, which I've had a ride in, etc. I mean, it's well advanced. I think the actual technology is well advanced, even if the infrastructure isn't.
Yes, and of course lithium-ion batteries were not able to power the earth-moving vehicles, the big trucks or the trains. So that hydrogen engines for these are way ahead of hydrogen engines for our domestic vehicles. JCB have invented a hydrogen-powered, effectively it's a modified diesel engine, I understand, but it's powered by hydrogen and it can do the heavy lifting, the earth moving that these things need to do.
And can we just bury biomass before we move on to the next section? Because, I mean, governments are very keen on this. Governments worldwide, a huge proportion of the world's maize is grown specifically for biofuel. And the sort of, will you just discuss it? What is its real potential?
Can we distinguish biofuels and biomass? And I want to deal with biomass first. Biomass is basically wood being burnt for electricity. And England has the biggest European example of that, which is our Drax power station. That used to be coal-fired, but it's now converted to burning wood chips, wood pellets. Now the government, because there's some international agreement that burning wood is carbon neutral, that it's a contribution to our renewable energy sources. And the argument runs like this: if you burn wood today, the carbon dioxide it produces will be absorbed by the trees you plant to replace that wood burnt today, and the trees you plant will absorb that carbon dioxide. The trouble is the CO2 you would emit today by burning the wood might take 30 or 40 years to be reabsorbed by the trees you plant to replace it. There's a time lag between the production of CO2 and its reconsumption by growing photosynthesis, and that's a time lag we simply cannot afford, because if we're going to get to net zero by 2050, we'll still have a lot of carbon dioxide floating around the atmosphere produced by Drax burning coal wood pellets today. And the extraordinary thing about Drax is the claim is that Drax produces 17% of our renewable energy. It looks good on the profit and loss accounts for net zero of our government. but it shouldn't. It shouldn't be on there. It shouldn't be on there at all. So, for example, Drax is burning 20,000 tons of wood pellets every day. 20,000 tons. And they're not grown in England. They're grown in North America, they're shipped to England, they're trained up to Drax, they're burnt in Drax, or a bit comes from Europe. But if you take Drax out of our renewable contributions, there's a great big hole left, because the government claims we've decarbonised by 43% since whatever 1990. Take Drax out, the figure falls to just more than half of that. I should add about biofuels. So biofuels is simply using maize to turn into alcohol, whatever, for powering. The trouble with biofuels is they're very land intensive, very land hungry, and I'm not sure that certainly overpopulated countries like ours can afford to waste land on biofuels, when with luck there will be hydrogen, for example, to do what biofuels are scheduled to do.
This brings me very neatly, your reference to land hungriness, to a scheme planned for near where we both live, to the west of Oxford, called the Botley West Solar Farm, which some people are getting very excited about. There's a huge literature on it, etc., etc. But you, for example, you are among the people, or one of the leaders of the people, who are opposing this scheme, even though in general you're very keen on the idea of renewables, obviously. Can you first of all just describe the scheme to us? What have they got in mind for Botley West?
The idea for Botley West is it's a large solar installation. It's a ground-mounted solar installation, so it's on farmland, and it stretches from Wootton and Tackley north of Woodstock to the north, through Blaydon to Ensham in the middle part, and then there's a small part between Farmore, Botley and Cumnor in the south, which also connects up to the national grid. The total area of those three sites is 1,400 hectares, 3,500 acres, of which about 900 will be covered with solar panels. 900, 2,500 acres, if you like. Now, 900 hectares is 9 square kilometres of glass and steel. It's going to be a blot on the landscape, but will it contribute to our net zero ambitions? Well, it will, but I think it will at a cost. So Botley West will involve putting out more than 2 million solar panels. The question is, where will these solar panels be sourced? China produces 85% of the world's solar panels, so it's likely to be China. And there's a huge blot of slave labour being used to produce solar panels in China. It's a terrible example of slave labour use. And it's scheduled to provide the national grid with 840 megawatts of power from that whole system. Now, our study has shown that those 1,300 megawatts solar panels will never ever provide more than about 600 megawatts of power, ever. This is on the brightest hour of the brightest day, mid-June. And at worst, it will provide something like 300 megawatts in winter. So it can never provide the 840 megawatts of power it's contracted to the national grid to give. So I put it to you, do we sacrifice all of our lovely rural landscapes around Oxford? And it's not just the area, it's where the area is. It's between a world-class university city, Oxford City, and Blenheim, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Blenheim Park, Blenheim Palace. And the thing about a UNESCO World Heritage Site is it's not just the building and the grounds, Blenheim Park itself, which is the site, it's the landscape surrounding the park, which is protected under World Heritage status. And the Blenheim Management Plan itself said, produced only in 2017, said that we want to preserve the landscape and rural character of the area around the park, and therefore we don't want to put wind farms or solar farms on the Blenheim estate. This was just 6 years ago.
Aren't you being a bit of a NIMBY? I mean, if you're going to have solar farms at all, they've got to go somewhere, and the argument is that you need to put them where people need the power. And in other words, it's got to be near Oxford if it's going to power Oxford. Otherwise, what's the point of it?
Well, there are lots of different aspects of that question. Let's start with the power. First of all, the Botley West power output will not go to Oxford City. The southernmost site, based in Botley, will have its own substation, and it's sited there because it's directly below the National Grid 400 kilovolt overhead lines. Now, if you look at Botley, there's some huge pylons there. They're going sort of effectively from east to west. They're ending up in Gloucester somewhere. And once the electricity goes to the national grid, it's like the arterial system of your body. Once it's in the arterial system, it can go anywhere. So power from Botley might keep the lights on in Cumbria just as likely as the lights on in Cowley. And although the developers claim we need to put it close to Oxford City because Oxford City is a great devourer of electricity, the second part of that sentence is true. Oxford City is using a lot of electricity, but the first part isn't true. The Botley West power will not go to Oxford City. It will go into the national grid. And my worry is not only the siting between Oxford and Blenheim, but 75% of the proposed solar farm would be on Oxford's green belt. Now, green belts are a really rather precious commodity that we should be trying to save. But more and more around Oxford and elsewhere, the green belt is being used for housing developments, being gobbled up by very often executive houses, not social housing, that it should be used for to help nurses and doctors and teachers, for example, that Oxford City is very short of, is being used to produce executive houses. If you take up yet more of the green belt with something that need not be there, you could argue the houses need to be there if they were for the right reason, but no solar farm needs to be on a green belt because it goes into the national grid. That national grid can distribute electricity absolutely everywhere. So in theory, electricity can be produced anywhere, and can be distributed everywhere. Now that depends on a good national grid, and we might want to talk about that, but the theory is there. It's electricity.
All right, well, just in passing, is the national grid as it stands up to the task?
You know the answer to that, Colin. No, I'm afraid it isn't. And it isn't for all sorts of reasons. Traditionally, our electricity, of course, was produced by a very few power stations, very energy-dense power stations, coal, oil, gas, or nuclear. So you had a network of supplies stretching from a few points on the compass, connecting up the nation. Now, if you've got a more distributed production system, like solar farms all over the place, or wind farms, or offshore wind, you have to redesign the grid from its previous configuration to the new configuration, picking up electricity from many different places. And secondly, of course, you have to increase the overall capacity, because as we decarbonize our economy, we are electrifying it. So we're using more and more electricity. So we have to have, current debate, more pylons, more overhead lines to distribute that electricity. There are certainly prices we have to pay for electrification, but I don't think solar farms on productive farmlands is a price that we need to pay, for the simple reason that there is a much better alternative.
Good. We'll come to that. Can we just briefly talk about green belts, because not many people understand what green belt really is, and it's sort of quite an important concept.
Well, the green belts were designed for 5 main reasons, and I can't remember all of them, but the first one was to prevent urban sprawl. It was to provide an amenity for the people living in the city to get fresh air, to get exercise and so on. And it was to stop that urban expansion, which it has very successfully done in places like Oxford, Cambridge. There are only about 12 designated green belts across the country. People think every town's got a green belt. It doesn't have a green belt. But green belts collectively take up about 12 to 15%, I think, of the total land area. And because they're close to cities, and because they haven't yet been built upon, they're like catnip to developers. Developers want to build houses close to cities because that's where the demand is, and make a fortune doing so. And the green belt is the natural target. But it would be a tragedy, because if we didn't have green belt, we'd have the situation that we can see in America, around Los Angeles, for example, which is urban sprawl. It was a small city, it's just sprawled and sprawled and sprawled without limit. And the other function of the Greenbelt was to stop the amalgamation of close-by towns. As towns get bigger, they amalgamate into one huge conurbation, like sort of Greater Manchester conurbation, although Manchester has a Greenbelt. It was to stop all that. I think it was to keep the landscape more human-friendly, and I think it's been a very successful job. And the reason why developers want to, and the current NPPF consultation is questioning the future role of the Greenbelt. I think that the reason why the Greenbelt has been so useful is that, as I said, it's kept development on a human scale.
And of course, the Botley scheme will, as you've said, encroach seriously on that.
It would, and it was an accident that happened. They didn't plan it that way, but the land that was offered by the Blenheim Estates to put the solar installation on happened to be a lot of it on the Oxford's Greenbelt. The farmland was in Oxford's Greenbelt. So Greenbelts are very often farmland.
Incidentally, apropos, you mentioned Los Angeles. I mean, San Diego is, I think, 80 miles to the south of Los Angeles. And I used to read the novel, I still do, the novels of John Steinbeck, which San Diego was the big city that they occasionally referred to. But it was totally separate from Los Angeles in the 1930s. And now the two are contiguous.
Yes. I think that's a day. So Greenbelts are wonderful. We should do our very best to preserve them. But I'm not hopeful, especially with the current government. Its insistence on that huge housing target, which in my view cannot be justified at all for reasons I could take a long time to explain. And in meeting that target, I know the Oxford district councils will be forced to look at the Greenbelt for development, because much of the housing need in Oxfordshire is within Oxford City. And so Oxford City exports its unmet housing needs to the district councils. They are sort of obliged to provide for that unmet need. And of course, they look to places near to the city, within their districts, that is available, and that's the Greenbelt. And in fact, there was very little incursion of Greenbelts anywhere until about the 1990s. The Greenbelts were doing a good job. But since the 1990s, we've lost 500,000 hectares of Greenbelt land to housing.
The claims for the Botley West solar farm say that all your sort of criticisms are more or less answered, and they say they have Botley West, I'm quoting for the blurb, Botley West now includes a landscape and ecology master plan and will deliver a biodiversity net gain of at least 70%. What do you make of that?
Well, let's go back to how you introduced this question. The claims for Botley West have been met. The claims for Botley West in terms of energy production, I don't think they have been met. Looking at the biodiversity claims, many solar installers these days claim huge biodiversity benefits for installing solar panels. And the idea is that you might increase the biodiversity. Let's imagine you put a solar farm on pasture land or meadows or farmland, effectively. If you put solar panels on and you have wildflower meadows beneath the panels, it's like a sort of bucolic rural idyll. You've got energy production, you've got wildflower meadows. It turns out that it doesn't work like that, because you can't produce wildflower meadows beneath solar panels. It just doesn't work. They run riot, the weeds grow, they overgrow the solar panels. You have to cut the vegetation down underneath the solar panels, otherwise it's simply overwhelmed. So the biodiversity benefits tend to be wildflower meadows or bee-friendly meadows or whatever around the solar farms, the bits surrounding the panels. And this is where the biodiversity net gain claims come in. And I cannot understand the figures that the developers are claiming. A 70% biodiversity net gain. I've seen 150%. I mean, these are nonsense figures. They never ever explain how these numbers are arrived at. They are all nodding to the requirement in the recent environmental law that all future development should involve a minimum 10% increase in biodiversity of a development, a building site, for example. And that's enshrined in environmental law. And there's a DEFRA spreadsheet that allows developers to look at the biodiversity of a site before development and then the biodiversity of a site after development, to compare the two and then to make sure that there's a net gain of 10% of the biodiversity after development. Now, if you turn half a field into houses, it's very clear you've reduced the biodiversity of the field. So the 10% net gain either comes from improving the biodiversity on the other half of the field, or increasing the biodiversity of an off-site, a site elsewhere, maybe close to the building site. And the DEFRA metric involves identifying the habitat before development, pastureland, the habitat after development, wildflower meadows, for example, and each habitat type is assigned a metric value. It's a number. It's, let's say, 10 per hectare. Now, that number 10 has got nothing to do with the species there, the number of species or the value of those species. It's simply a number. And within the DEFRA metric, the value of 10 is regarded as twice as good as the value of 5 in terms of contribution to biodiversity. Now, those metric values come from habitat classification. They don't come from the animals or even the plants there. They come from habitat type. Pastureland has a certain metric value, chalk grassland has a different metric value, woodland has a higher metric value. Woodland's got more biodiversity, obviously. Whether it should have that metric is a very debatable point. So you add up the numbers before and after development and you want the 10% net gain. Now, the whole flaw in all the solar proposal arguments is that if you look in the DEFRA list of habitat types before and after development, there is no habitat type that says, well, it was pastureland, it's now covered with solar panels. No habitat type involves solar panels, so you cannot estimate the biodiversity of a site after the panels have been in place. It's not possible. You cannot put the metric value on it. So you can't use the standard metric enshrined within environmental law that all developers have to obey for building houses. You cannot apply this to solar farms. So coming back to your question, well, how do they produce a number like 70% increase? I have absolutely no idea, Colin, and it would be worth challenging the developers on this. My guess is as follows, that, for example, hedgerow is a very biodiverse, especially mature hedgerow, is a very biodiverse habitat. If a developer says, well, look, we've got 5 kilometres of hedgerow now, and we're going to plant 5 more, so we'll have 10 kilometres of hedgerow, we've increased biodiversity by 100%. They might be doing something like this. They might be saying just increase a certain habitat type. But of course, a young hedgerow has nothing like the biodiversity of a 500-year-old hedgerow. So these figures are deeply suspicious.
And the idea that if you double the length of a hedgerow,
yes,
you haven't increased the diversity, really increased the area over the present diversity.
You've increased the quantity of hedgerow. Now, as I said, in the DEFRA metric, hedgerow has a certain biodiversity value. It's 10 or 20, I don't know what it is, per linear metre. So they imagine if they plant more, they'll get proportionately more. But the one thing about the metric is that when you try to replace like with like, for example, if you want to replace chalk grassland with exactly the same chalk grassland, there are penalties in the metric that says, well, if you try to plant chalk grassland, first of all, you may not succeed. And secondly, it's going to take you 30 years to get to the same state. Those penalties mean that if you even try to replace like with like, it's not area for area. Sure. So 10 kilometres of grassland taken out for building cannot be replaced by 10 kilometres of newly planted grassland. In fact, you have to increase it by 3 or 4 or 5-fold. It's 50 hectares of planted grassland to replace 10 hectares of grassland planted with houses.
Just to nail this slightly further, the argument about biodiversity brings me back to the same sort of arguments were applied to HS2, were they not? And they would knock down 400-year-old forest.
Yes. Oh yes, yes.
So we're going to plant loads of saplings.
Yes. Yes. And in fact, there was the example near Culver, that was at SSI near Culver, which is an ancient woodland. And HS2 said, well, we're going to move the woodland. And we're going to take saplings from the woodland and replant them. We just move the woodland. I mean, the mindlessness of that idea. They're not thinking as ecologists, they're thinking as accountants, I think.
Sounds like Macbeth, actually. Dunsinane comes to
yes, yes.
It's also been objected that the Botley West solar farm will be built too close to domestic houses. And the planners of the Botley West scheme say, no, we've increased the minimum buffer zone distances between solar panels and all buildings, as well as providing significant increases in the buffer zones near residential areas. And for good measure, they say, Botley West seeks to increase recreational use and access across the site through the creation of new footpaths and cycle paths. And sorry, just to nail it finally, Botley West is exploring a dynamic and wide-ranging community benefits package. In other words, it sounds idyllic.
Yeah.
The whole thing sewn
I
up.
think I can quote Mandy Rice Davis at you at that. They would say that, wouldn't they? I think so. You've got three things there. First of all, they've changed the boundaries. You can change the boundaries. You can't move the houses. So when the scheme was first suggested, I looked at the houses around the red line boundary of Botley West. There are 11,000 properties within 1.5 kilometres, and I'll explain why that's an important statistic. Now, first of all, Botley West would be the 12th largest solar farm on planet Earth. It's by far and away the largest in Europe. It would be the 12th largest on planet Earth. Most of the rest, huge solar farms, they're built in desert areas, sunny desert areas, a long way from habitation. So it's completely different from all the other large solar farms on planet Earth. You can move the boundaries a bit, as I say, you can't move the houses. There will still be 11,000 houses within 1.5 kilometres of Botley West, however much they move the boundaries. And they're moving the boundaries by no more than tens of metres. For example, there are bits of ancient woodland almost surrounded by solar panels. Now, the statutory requirement for development around the edge of ancient woodland is something like 50 metres. It's nothing like enough. And the original boundaries were at 50 metres. They may have moved those. But those 11,000 houses within 1.5 kilometres, there are studies, global studies, that now show there is an impact on house values by solar developments. They simply change the landscape, they change the attractiveness of the landscape to local people, and therefore they change the value of properties. Now, the impact of solar developments on house values is the so-called externality. It's a cost of development not borne by the developers. And in regular planning law, you can't do anything but externalities, because if the value of your individual house is affected by, let's say, a road that they plan to build next to it, planning is not allowed to take that into account. A single house. If you've got 11,000 houses equally affected, I think that can no longer apply. It's really quite significant. And we've done some studies based on European analysis, producing significant results that houses within 100 to 200 metres of solar farms, much smaller than Botley West, lose about 6% of their market values. And that impact falls away with distance, and it falls to about 0 at 1.5 kilometres. So we've applied that decrease in values to all the houses within 1.5 kilometres, and found that Botley West will decrease the overall value of all those houses by £150 million. Million, sorry. The total value of the houses will be about 5 billion, and their value will be reduced by 150 million if Botley West is built. Now, as I say, it's an externality. Who should pay the cost? Because there's a private benefit going on here. The private benefit is to the investors in Botley West, and there's a public harm to the 11,000 people who happen to live near or close to it. The second thing that you said is that, well, they've promised to put more footpaths through. They have indeed, but they're putting footpaths through an industrial installation in which the installation will be at least 2.5 metres high. That's the height of the solar panels. So the fences around the fields, around the outside, will be at least 2.5 metres high, probably 3 metres high. They'll have security lights, they'll have security cameras, which we are promised won't be lit at night. But certain of those security cameras are pointing at the installations, which they will need to light up if people get in and start to fiddle with it. And so a footpath might be through a solar farm in which you've got rather narrow alleyways. Imagine a green, a corridor with fences 3 meters high either side, disguised with some sort of undergrowth. And the undergrowth would maybe have to be coniferous trees for all seasonal. If you put deciduous trees, you'd be able to see the solar panels in winter through the branches. So there may be more footpaths, but they won't give you the feeling of countryside as you walk along them. And then the third thing you mention is they're offering community benefits. Now, these really are crumbs from the table. The two things they've mentioned so far is offering certain areas of the landscape for essentially allotments, growing your own food. Great, you can do that anywhere. Farmers can do that anywhere. The other thing is offering a community benefit in the form of payment to the community. We've got a solar farm, we acknowledge it's impacting you. The offer so far from Botley West has been 50,000 a year. Now, if it were a wind farm, the wind farm community have established they will pay 5% of the nameplate capacity or the output in community benefits a year. If you apply that 5% to Botley West, the community benefit should be of the order of £5 million a year to the communities, not 50,000. The solar industry hasn't yet signed up to any agreed community benefit, but it really should. It's really getting away with offering a crumb of comfort to these communities who will be very, very affected by solar panels for the next 40 years. And these are described as temporary. Now, there's no way that an installation is temporary. A child growing up amongst the solar panels now, she will be a grandmother by the time those 2 million solar panels are removed. And by the way, they possibly won't be removed if it's still profitable, because within the NPPF, we already have a clause that says renewable energy can be repurposed or the lifetime can be extended.
Fair enough. Well, not fair enough, very unfair. It is the case, as you've said, that in the Botley West scheme, Blenheim Palace, in other words, the Duke of Marlborough's estate, is very closely involved. Now, in view of all the caveats that you've put forward, what's in it for them? Why are they doing it?
Well, for all landowners, the attraction is the rent that you get from the land. And currently, the rent from a solar farm is about £1,000 per acre. The maximum profit, the profit that you can expect from regular farming from an acre is about £150 to £200. So you can see automatically that it's very attractive to landowners. And landowners, the key here is landowners. Of course, a lot of farms are leased. So a leaseholder farmer, whether he likes it or not, might be turfed off his land if the landowner decides he'd rather be solar farming than real farming. And this is happening a lot. You can see why it's attractive. In fact, Minette Batters, who's the ex-president of the NFU, she was at a conference in St Antony's recently where they were talking about solar farms. And she said the following, I'm reading here because it's a direct quote. What farmers like about solar is that it's index linked. It's a locked-in benefit for 20 years. It's index linked, it's going to go up. It's very appealing to farm business. What's not to like, she asks. A lot of landowners want to put up solar farm. Landowners, not farmers. There's only one winner effectively, and that's the landowner. Everybody else in the area hates it. Everybody else in the area hates it. That is it in a nutshell. This is the ex-president of the NFU admitting that large area solar farms on landscapes that used to be farmland is not welcomed by communities. Now, I want to stress, I am not against solar energy. Solar energy on roofs, yes. Solar energy on brownfields, solar energy car park, absolutely. If you want to put a solar panel in your home, absolutely. It's when the solar energy gets beyond what you might call the human scale, because there are some very good community-owned solar projects. Westmill near Swindon, there's one near Charlbury. Fantastic example. The community effectively decided, we've got this piece of land here, we'd like to grow our own electricity. Fine. It's when it gets onto into the corporate view sites that I really worry. And I'll tell you why. It's not just coming back to answer your question. Corporations are seeing a huge profit to be made from solar installation. It's the new Wild West. What the Duke himself thinks of solar farms, I think, is not common public knowledge, but the estate is in debt. That is recorded by private eye. So you can see that an investment that produces 5 times the yield per acre of land is attractive.
I don't want this to be a local discussion, but what applies here in Oxford, Blenheim, could be applied. The same could be true almost anywhere. I mean, it's a general problem we're discussing here.
I think the reason why investors get interested in solar is when they get to a large scale. 1,300 megawatts, the 12th largest on the planet, suddenly it gets interesting. And in England, the applications for solar farms until about 2018, they were all pretty small scale, 5 megawatts, 10 megawatts was large. And then post 2016, there was a huge fuss getting the first very large solar farm, which because it's large is classified as a nationally significant infrastructure project, an NSIP, with quite different development rules, which you might like to talk about. That first NSIP took a long time to get through the hoops, the development. It was then approved, and since then we've had a more or less tsunami of applications for larger and larger NSIP schemes, US being the biggest, but it's not going to be the biggest for longer because, as one of the developers said, well, what size would you like us to be? And of course, the answer to that from the developer's point of view is big as you can get it, because the marginal cost of an extra field is minimal, but the marginal benefits are just the same as the original benefits. They are well, from the landowner's point of view, £1,000 per acre. From the developer's point of view, that's probably 20 or 30,000 revenue per acre.
Last point then. Renewable energy is obviously vital. You're obviously in favour of it. You're not against solar in general, but only the very large scale stuff. If we're going to have renewable energy and we're going to limit seriously the role of solar, because we're forced to, because we're a northern country and all that kind of stuff, what are the options? How are we going to meet our zero target and so on?
If you look at the package of renewables we have, and I don't know if you want to put nuclear in there, but nuclear provides us with base load. Nuclear could be important, and if we get fusion energy, it's free of the nuclear residues. Within the package of renewables, we've got wind, we've got solar, we've got tidal. Now, I put it to you that if we were a poor landlocked country like Switzerland, we don't have the options for offshore wind and we don't have the options for tidal. Switzerland, if it's going to go net zero, it's got to go for solar. In the UK, we have alternatives. We have offshore wind. And the great attraction, there are many attractions of offshore wind, but first of all, it's offshore. It's not taking up valuable, productive farmland. It's not destroying the view of wonderful rural habitats. Secondly, it's very much more productive than solar. So I talked about load factors earlier. The load factor for a solar installation is about 11%. The load factor for offshore wind, the proportion or percent of times it produces its maximum power, is 40% on average. It's 50% in winter. It's producing the maximum power, the number stamped on the side of the turbine, for half the time in winter, which is of course when our energy demands are greatest. So if you think about the problem of all renewables is intermittency, the more intermittent a system, the greater the need for storage of the energy. If solar is only working for 11% of the time, we have to have huge storage facilities to provide the energy for the other 90% of the time. Wind is only not working essentially for 50% of the time. We need smaller storage facilities. So it's a question of what's not to like about offshore wind. It's much more efficient, it's out of sight, and it's producing energy for half the time rather than a tenth of the time. If you went into a shop and said, I need an electric freezer and I need it to work 24 hours a day, and they offered you one, well, this one works for 2 hours a day and this one works for 12 hours a day, which one are you going to choose? I mean, really, which one are you going to choose?
Well, thank you very much, David
pleasure.
Rogers.
Thank you.